In. In the spring of 1845, two proud ships slipped into the icy labyrinth of the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Their mission? To uncover a long-sought maritime route known as the Northwest Passage, a path that promised to link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the frozen crown of the world. At the entrance of a vast Arctic channel, they met a pair of whaling vessels. The encounter was brief, just a cordial exchange before the explorers pressed on. Neither side knew it then, but those whalers would be the last living souls outside the crew to ever lay eyes on the ships or the men aboard. For more than a century afterward, their fate would be wrapped in shadows and speculation. Only in recent decades have fragments of the truth emerged, and what they reveal is far darker than anyone of that era could have imagined. This is the story of the Franklin expedition, an Arctic odyssey turned nightmare. Viewer discretion is advised. Life in the mid-19th century must have felt, in its own way, like the dizzying digital boom of our modern era. Technology, science, and global connectivity were leaping forward in ways people had never experienced before. The Enlightenment had reshaped thought, the Napoleonic Wars had redrawn political maps, and the Industrial Revolution, driven by steam power, was transforming every facet of daily life. For the first time in history, humanity was on the verge of charting every coastline on the planet. Only one great mystery remained unsolved: a viable sea route through the icy channels north of mainland Canada, the fabled Northwest Passage. The stakes were huge. With no Panama Canal in existence, ships had to take absurdly long detours, either all the way around South America or across the vast expanse around Africa. A shortcut through the Arctic would be revolutionary for trade and naval power. And even if it proved useless for commerce, the prestige of filling in the final blank on the world map was an irresistible lure for the British Admiralty. One man in particular saw it as the perfect capstone to his career: Sir John Barrow, the Admiralty's second secretary. At 81 years old, Barrow wasn't about to let this last great prize slip through Britain's fingers. He ordered one final grand expedition to claim it. Choosing a leader proved harder than expected. His first pick, William Parry, had had his fill of Arctic hardships. The second, James Ross, was persuaded by his wife not to go. The third candidate, Francis Crozier, was dismissed for being Irish and of low birth, a snub typical of the class prejudices of the time. The fourth, James Fitzjames, was deemed too young and untested. Finally, Barrow settled on the fifth man on his list, Sir John Franklin. This would be Franklin's third attempt to find the passage. His earlier overland expeditions had been a mix of endurance and disaster, one infamously ending with survivors boiling leather and eating moss to stave off starvation. It earned him the unflattering nickname, the man who ate his boots. And yet, Franklin was admired by his men. He was devout, paternal, and deeply concerned for the welfare of those under his command. He could be rash in pursuit of a goal, but he radiated a kind of stubborn optimism, something the Admiralty hoped would serve him well. He wouldn't be alone in command. Crozier, the man previously passed over, agreed to return as captain of HMS Terror, while Fitzjames took charge of HMS Erebus. Franklin himself would lead the expedition overall. The ships themselves were small fortresses. The Erebus, built in 1826, and the Terror, launched in 1813, were originally bomb vessels, designed to fire heavy mortars and reinforced with extra bracing to withstand recoil. This made them well suited to resist ice pressure. For the expedition, their wooden hulls were further thickened and clad in iron along the bows and waterlines. Internal heating systems were added, and, most innovative of all, each ship was fitted with a retractable screw propeller powered by a converted steam locomotive engine. They carried desalination units to produce fresh water, an experimental diving suit for clearing ice from rudders, and even one of the first commercially available cameras, the daguerreotype, to document their journey. For most of the 134 men, the Arctic was as alien as another planet. Only 6 officers had been there before. They were sailing into a land of unending daylight or darkness, where compasses spun unpredictably and the sea could turn to solid ice for months. On May 19, 1845, the Erebus and Terror departed from Greenhithe, England. Alongside the sailors and marines were a ship's cat, a Newfoundland dog named Neptune, and a Capuchin monkey called Jacko, Lady Franklin's gift. Their stores included 2 tons of tobacco, 12,000 books, theater costumes, sports gear, and 16,000 tin cans of food, a cutting-edge solution meant to preserve fruit and vegetables against scurvy. After brief stops in Scotland and Greenland, 5 men fell ill and were sent home. The rest pressed on into Baffin Bay, where 2 whaling ships waved them into Lancaster Sound and into history's embrace. They would never be seen alive again. Sailing in Arctic waters was never straightforward. Even in summer, the channels were littered with drifting floes that could batter a hull to splinters if approached carelessly. Pushing through 2 aggressively risked crippling the ships before they'd even begun their real work. The Franklin ships had one particular weakness the Admiralty hadn't fully accounted for. The new steam engines, so proudly installed, could produce barely 25 horsepower, enough to push the vessels at about 4 knots. That was a fraction of the power modern icebreakers of similar size could manage even in that era. Worse still, the Admiralty had only supplied 12 days' worth of coal, clearly imagining the engines as an occasional luxury rather than a workhorse. The result was predictable. Progress was slow. By the first winter freeze of 1845, they had managed to circle Cornwallis Island and backtrack to Beechey Island, only about 350 kilometers from where the whalers had last seen them. Yet, in the brutal Arctic, that was considered respectable advancement. When the ice locked the Erebus and Terror into place, the crews set about wintering over. Snow was banked high against the hulls for insulation, sails were struck, and a giant canvas tent was stretched over the decks to provide a bit of shelter from the wind. Below, the men crowded together in cramped quarters, reading, writing letters, or keeping busy with the daily routines of survival. That winter claimed its first victims. 3 sailors died and were buried in the frozen ground of Beechey Island. Autopsies, performed more than a century later, revealed a disturbing truth. Their bodies contained extremely high levels of lead. The source? Their very food and water. The 16,000 cans, hastily produced by the cheapest contractor, were riddled with flaws. Poor soldering left strings of lead inside like dripped wax. Many tins were improperly sealed, allowing rot, mold, and botulism to creep in. The desalination system, meant to produce drinkable water, used lead piping that corroded in the salty brine. The result was slow, chronic poisoning. The lead clouded minds, weakened bodies, and destroyed immune systems. Combined with a likely zinc deficiency, it meant the men's own bones could leach lead into their bloodstream. And as if that weren't enough, tuberculosis had already been present, carried by some of the men sent home in Greenland. Still, when the ice began to break the next year, the ships pressed onward. In 1846, Franklin aimed for the southern tip of what was then uncertain territory, King William Island. If it proved an island, the eastern channel might lead to open waters. If it was a peninsula, that path would be a dead end. The alternative was to go west, toward their ultimate goal. Franklin chose west. It was a catastrophic choice. The west side of King William Island acts like an ice trap, funneling vast sheets from 2 different channels into a narrow corridor. The Erebus and Terror sailed directly into one of the most treacherous ice choke points on Earth. By September 12, 1846, both ships were locked fast. They would not move again that year. Back in England, Lady Franklin began to grow anxious. Spending 1 winter in the ice was expected, 2 was alarming. She petitioned, and then outright demanded, that the Admiralty send a rescue mission. The Admiralty was slow to act, publicly insisting all was well, though they quietly began drafting search plans. Lady Franklin, undeterred, rallied public sympathy, even enlisting her friend Charles Dickens to campaign on her behalf. Meanwhile, aboard the trapped ships, another unseen disaster was unfolding. The canned fruit, meant to supply vital vitamin C against scurvy, was losing its potency due to improper sealing. Without it, the disease began creeping into the crew. In May 1847, a small party trekked over the ice to leave messages in stone cairns on King William Island. They reported their winter at Beechey, the voyage around Cornwallis, and their current coordinates. The note ended cheerfully. All well. But the optimism wouldn't last. That summer turned out to be one of the coldest in centuries. Modern ice core studies confirm that 1845 to 1859 marked the peak of a frigid 50-year stretch. Even in high summer, the ice never melted enough to release the ships. Then came the worst blow. On June 11, 1847, Sir John Franklin died. With Franklin gone, command passed to Francis Crozier. The men were sick, frostbitten, and malnourished, but worse, hope was slipping away. The Terror had begun to list badly in the ice, forcing most of the crew into the Erebus. The smaller vessel became little more than a frozen storeroom for excess supplies and, grimly, for the dead. By the winter of 1847 to 1848, starvation loomed. The remaining rations, many spoiled, would not last another season. On April 25, 1848, a desperate update was scrawled in the margins of the earlier message left on King William Island. It recorded Franklin's death, along with the loss of 9 officers and 15 men in total. The ships had been abandoned 3 days prior. 105 survivors planned to march overland, 150 miles to the Back River, where they hoped to find a Hudson's Bay Company outpost. This was no simple walk. The route cut across ice-choked coasts and barren tundra. To survive, the men needed the ship's massive lifeboats to navigate rivers and coastal waters. Each weighed several tons, so they were mounted on sledges and dragged by hand across jagged ice and gravel. Imagine hauling 8,000 pounds while your joints ache from scurvy, your thoughts fog from lead poisoning, and your stomach gnaws with hunger. The march was doomed from the start. Men collapsed along the way, left behind in makeshift camps. Bodies would later be found scattered across the route, evidence of groups splintering off, some perhaps turning back toward the ships, others veering off on alternate paths. Inuit oral histories tell of strange encounters in this period. Hunters reported seeing Europeans with guns and pikes on the Adelaide Peninsula, accompanied by a large dog matching Neptune's description. Others spoke of finding an abandoned ship still smoldering from a lit stove, bunks occupied by corpses. Starvation Cove, aptly named, became the final resting place for many. Some survivors, Inuit said, resorted to cannibalism. In one account, 4 men were taken in by local families. Only one, who refused to eat human flesh, was starving. The others had been sustaining themselves in ways the Inuit found deeply unsettling. Back in Britain, public pressure finally spurred massive search efforts. By 1850, no fewer than 11 ships were scouring the Arctic, many enduring disasters of their own. The HMS Resolute became trapped and abandoned, only to be recovered by Americans the following year. Its timber would later become the famous Resolute desk in the Oval Office. In 1853, during another rescue mission, Captain Robert McClure aboard HMS Investigator accidentally became the first to traverse the Northwest Passage, though his ship too was frozen in and abandoned before completing the journey. Inuit testimony during these years was often dismissed or ignored by Victorian Britain. They told of meeting starving men, of mass graves, and of grisly scenes of cannibalism. Charles Dickens himself wrote multiple articles insisting such claims were slanders against British honor. It would take more than a century for archaeologists to verify the Inuit accounts. Small victories came slowly. In 1854, explorer John Ray returned with artifacts from the expedition, purchased from Inuit who had found them among the dead. In 1859, a party funded by Lady Franklin recovered the final written messages from the Erebus and Terror, the same ones that recorded Franklin's death and the crew's abandonment of the ships. Over the following decades, the Arctic yielded occasional finds, skeletons, scraps of clothing, bits of equipment. In 1993, researchers uncovered what they believe was the expedition's last camp. There, the bones bore unmistakable cut marks, hands and feet removed, marrow extracted, exactly as the Inuit had described. The greatest breakthroughs came in the 21st century. In 2014, the wreck of HMS Erebus was found in shallow water off the Adelaide Peninsula, exactly where Inuit hunters had said it lay. 2 years later, HMS Terror was discovered in a place aptly named Terror Bay. Remarkably intact, the ship rested silently in the dark, its contents preserved by the cold. The finds have reignited investigations, with archaeologists hopeful that the wrecks might finally tell the last, unrecorded chapters of the Franklin expedition. Inside, There may be logbooks, personal journals, or artifacts that explain the crew's final choices. Work began in earnest in 2022 after pandemic delays. And though nearly 2 centuries have passed since the Erebus and Terror set sail, their story remains incomplete. A frozen mystery still thawing, piece by piece, in the Arctic silence.